An hour east of Phoenix, Arizona. Might be a little too big.
We kind of reconditioned and repurposed a lot of old mining equipment.
More than a mile beneath the desert surface.
You'll get more comfortable once you standing on the ground, and you'll forget that you're so far below the ground.
The mining giant Rio Tinto thinks it's found one of the largest undeveloped copper deposits in the world.
All right.
We had a chance to tour the facility back in late March. The Resolution copper mine sits on an ore deposit that may produce as much as 40 billion pounds of the metal over 40 years.
This is brand new.
It's enough to meet roughly a quarter of projected U.S. demand. It lies almost 7,000 feet under the surface, just over a mile, equivalent to 4.5 Empire State Buildings. We went down into the mine with Resolution Copper's president, Vicky Pesce.
The deposit is incredible. It's 2 billion tons at 1.5% copper. It's the second largest undeveloped copper deposit in the world. That's 25% of the U.S. demand for copper. And the grade is very high, 1.5%. Most of the copper that's mined in the U.S. today from a handful of mines that are very old, over 100 years, are less than 0.5% of copper. So this is quite a rich deposit, and it will be operated for decades.
It's hard to overstate how dire the copper shortage is in this era of AI. Copper use is soaring, particularly for data centers and defense. By 2040, demand is expected to rise over 40%.
We haven't seen a response on supply increasing by 50% year on year. Ultimately, if you want economic growth, if you want data center build-outs, if you want defense build-outs, you need copper.
Orion Delanois is Executive Director of Energy Transition and Critical Minerals at S&P.
I think one of the interesting snippets is, data centers and hyperscalers are planning to spend about $700 billion in CapEx this year. So when you're looking at the top 30 mining companies in the world, their entire CapEx for this year is going to be about 100 billion tons. So on the demand side, you get 600 billion tons of CapEx in data centers. And on the supply side, you get just 100 billion tons in CapEx in mines. So there's a disconnect here between supply and demand.
In the past, in the heyday of copper mining in the US, you'd find really great quality copper that was easy to mine, easy to process, and easy to refine.
Rosemary Katz is a copper analyst for Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
Now the material is deeper. The economics means you have to remove more waste, and hence you need more energy and time to process it. And those are the things that have been curtailing the number of new finds and investments into these discoveries.
Chile has always dominated global copper production, but in recent decades, the U.S. has lost ground to China, Peru, and the Congo, dropping from second globally.
Our ability to bring on new supply is critical, and our ability to keep the smelters we do have full is really a national security issue.
The U.S. has more than 275 million metric tons in reserves and resources, comparable to Canada and Australia combined. Yet only 3 mines have come into production since 2002. Regulation and legal challenges have meant, on average, a new U.S. mine takes nearly 29 years to go from discovery to production. That's 6 years slower than the global average.
So it's really important that because this takes time, we need to start now. And again, every day that we delay Resolution copper is another day that we continue to depend on foreign sources of copper. We have the resources here, and I think United States can really take control of their own destiny as far as copper production and close that chronic deficit that has existed for decades.
It's taken more than a dozen years for Resolution to do much more than drill a mine shaft.
This is good timing for you to be here.
In late March, the very day we filmed there, the project finally got the go-ahead.
This is a region where there is double-digit unemployment, and the jobs are meaningful. The economic development is meaningful. $1 billion a year into Arizona's economy is a really big deal.
The competition is not only over who has copper in the ground, it is over who can process it, move it, and turn it into usable metal fastest. China dominates that process, importing about 60% of global copper ore and concentrate, and producing more than 45% of the world's refined copper. about 14 million metric tons in 2025, compared to 850,000 in the U.S.
So the copper smelters, they've gone from 16 operating ones back in the 1980s to now just 2 operating assets in 2026. Some of them have closed because of environmental issues. Some of them have closed because of difficult economic situations. So now we're down to 2 processing facilities, and actually the US exports concentrate to other countries like Canada, South Korea, Mexico to get that mining product processed. So about 57% of the refined copper is imported from other countries for the US's domestic use. So there's a clear reliance on imports. Demand is growing by about 40% for the US between now and 2040. And that demand is going to be driven by data centers, it's going to be driven by energy transmission and distribution, it's going to be driven by clean technologies. And so some of those aspects become almost a national security issue.
When you talk about critical minerals and what we produce here in the United States, I think the mining industry gets forgotten about a little bit. I don't know if it's really underappreciated. I think it's just not really known to the general public. We take a lot of that stuff for granted, that when you flip a light switch, the power just comes on.
Nate Foster is the managing director of Rio Tinto Kennecott, one of only 2 facilities in the United States that is home to the entire copper supply chain.
From here, it goes through a crusher, goes on about a 5-mile conveyor belt to a concentrator. What a copper concentrator does is it takes that blasted rock, crushes it, pulverizes it, and then we actually float copper, believe it or not. And so the concentrator makes about a 25% pure copper concentrate. From there, it's shipped to the north of us to our smelter and refining, where it goes from a 25% copper concentrate through a series of refining furnaces.
Fired by natural gas, they refine the ore into what are called cathodes, 99.9% pure copper.
It's an absolutely fascinating, highly technical business. Kennecott, about 20% of all of this nation's refined cathode comes from our operation.
Other companies are working on different ways to fill the copper gap.
These are printed circuit boards.
One promising strategy, recycling scrap into domestic supply.
You can see copper traces.
The German copper company Arubis opened a recycling smelter in Augusta, Georgia last year and is already expanding it.
The US produces around 2 million metric tons of copper-containing scrap annually. And it's very fragmented. It's across the country. And most of it is still landfilled and exported. Most of it is exported actually to China. So that's why also the local recycling companies and the scrap dealers, they welcome us coming here because they don't have to export it to other countries. They can keep it in the country. So it comes from mostly medium and large recycling companies. There's different types of recycling material. There's on the one hand, there's the basic copper scrap. Then there's copper cables. But then there's also more complex recycling materials like circuit boards, which contain copper, but also other metals like gold, silver, nickel, tin, and so on, which are also attractive.
And how much can you produce?
Well, we just finished phase 1 here in our Richmond site. There we consume 90,000 tons of recycling material, and we produce 35,000 tons of blister copper. Now in summer we will finish phase 2, which is doubling the capacity. So when phase 2 is finished, we will have an output capacity of around 70,000 tons of blister copper.
We are aiming for about 180,000 tons of input material here for this facility, and we're also planning to produce roughly 180,000 tons of product, so we're very close to zero waste, converting everything into other materials.
David Schulteis is Arubis Richmond's president.
Back there at the end, you can see higher grade copper material. You can see the typical reddish color that comes with copper. For a layman looking at these materials, sometimes difficult to understand, is there even metal inside? I can guarantee you there's plenty of metal inside. This is really the material that we're looking for.
Wow.
And that's where the complexity is. Yeah, our main value contribution is to melt down the materials that we have, build the phases, separate the materials, and bring the variety of metals back into the industrial life cycle.
Scrap is just a portion of the story, so it's quite marginal, quite incremental. It won't close that gap that the US needs to close. It needs to close about 1 million tons of refined copper and scrap is just incremental gains.
Usually, markets are the key. The copper supply gap has prices for the metal near all-time highs, and that has more mines, smelters, and recycling plants on the drawing board. National security may drive regulatory relief, but for now, time remains the biggest obstacle. Copper may not get the attention of rare earths, but for the coming American economy, it's perhaps even more important.
When you look at these hyperscale data centers that are really around AI, they can consume as much as 50,000 tons of copper in one facility. 50,000 tons, right? So put that in perspective of Kennecott. All the metal that we mine in a year would supply only 4 data centers. And so when you start looking around the fundamentals of that demand that's coming with AI and data centers, you can't build them without copper.
So why is it important for investors to pay attention to all of this?
Copper is the metal of electrification. It is what really fuels the economy. You've probably used copper maybe a dozen times so far, by the time that you wake up. It is critically important, and the fact that it is needed so much in our daily lives, it's something everybody should be paying attention to.